screening your works at Frameline 41 this year. I first wanted to talk a little bit about, legacies and inherited representations, if you will, through very different approaches, style, and content. All of your work fits beautifully into a larger legacy of powerful queer filmmakers of color, Isaac Julian, Cheryl Dunye. I'm really going to do a roll call and invite them all into the space. I'm going there. Isaac Julian, Cheryl Dunye, Pratibha Parmar, Marlon Riggs, Arthur Dong, Yvonne Welbin, Richard Fung, and more recently Dee Rees, Courtney Ryan Ziegler, Andrew Ahn, and Desiree Akhavan. I'm curious, at what point in each of your lives did you realize that you had something to say and express, and that folks were eager to hear from you?
No big deal.
I mean, I was an art student when my brother was murdered. And so I had already been engaged in the process of using art as a means of political expression and sort of to explore different themes. I have to say that I didn't necessarily think that the world would be interested in what I had to say as much as I was interested in having the world hear what I had to say. And in 2006, when the silence that I had been in, along with the rest of my family, became a greater burden and a bigger fear than telling my brother's story, that's when I decided to make the film. But I had been influenced by Marlon Riggs and Agnes Varda and performance artists like Chris Burden and sculptors like Louise Bourgeois, who were taking sort of personal narratives and turning them into these really provocative works. And I was also not a film student; I was a photography student. So it was pretty easy for me once I started working on the film to know exactly what I wanted it to look like. But how the film would be received, I had no idea.
Thank you. Arshid, Kasir?
Thank you. I really just want to, first of all, thank you for having me on this panel with these esteemed filmmakers and artists, and so excited for their work here. And thank you to Frameline and everyone working here, and thank you to the audience for coming out on this afternoon to hear us speak. The film Abu is a very personal film about my very difficult relationship with my very devout Muslim Pakistani father. I really hesitated telling my own story because when I sometimes teach in Pakistan, I teach guerrilla filmmaking, and I'm from Montreal, and I always tell them, my students, don't navel gaze, and then I end up making the ultimate navel gazing film. But the fact is that the story had to be told. I was working on several fiction projects, and I just couldn't move on from this story of my father who had recently passed away in 2011. So I thought, okay, very reluctantly made a 3-minute teaser, which really a lot of people loved. And I became part of the Cuban Hat in Montreal. And it encouraged me to start working on this project. And then I raised some crowdfunding, and then I got a Canada Council grant, because in Canada we have a lot of public support. So I started getting those grants, so that really encouraged me to keep moving with this project. And that's how I got into it.
Thank you. Faz, you're up.
I have sort of a weird, sort of circuitous path to being an artist. I was a lawyer, don't judge me. I eventually in law school realized I wanted to take acting classes, and I did. I started acting, and then I realized as an actor that people kept telling me in the casting process that I wasn't any of the things that I am enough. I'm not Muslim or lesbian or Pakistani or queer or woman or any brown enough. And so I started writing, even though I didn't understand what it meant to be a writer, and started writing short films and web series, and places like Frameline and Outfest have actually been, I think of them as parents in a lot of ways for me, because they have said, oh, what you're doing matters, and we value your voice, and we're going to program you. So, that's sort of how I came to have a space in these festival worlds, and these spaces, and these, in front of you. The film itself, signature move for me, you saw a clip from. I mean, for me, I worked in sexual violence prevention for a long time, and I did a comedy educational show where we used comedy to talk about really tough topics, and that taught me, and I did this you know, locally in terms of the United States, at universities and colleges, and then I did this at military installations around the world for like every branch of the military you could think of. And what I learned was it didn't matter if you were a general in the Army or if you were a freshman at a community college in Kansas or Harvard, you were born into a rape culture. And the thing that we could do to create a different kind of conversation was use comedy. And so that's kind of deeply, not even kind of, it's deeply informed this thing that I was already doing as a human to survive, being a very brown girl in a very white world where I grew up. And for me, like, comedy is a way of not just survival, but of conversation, of communication, of connection. And so, you know, regardless of what I make, and Signature Move is such a great, my first feature, comedy's a part of it. Because I think in our darkest moments we laugh, and our darkest moments we can survive through laughter. Yeah, the film is exciting to have here, just because it's deeply intersectional. It's about a Pakistani Muslim woman, but it's also about brown-skinned women. It's about queer women. It's about women who just are as relatable as any other human being or woman there is. And I don't even remember the question anymore, but I was just following y'all's suit.
Thank you very much.
Which everyone looks impeccable.
This is a very well-dressed panel.
I know, I mean, look at that.
Snaps
Look
for
at
the
you
panel
two.
couture.
All three of you.
Same suit every festival.
Don't tell
That's
them.
a trick, it's working.
But you work it, you work it.
It's working.
Filmmaker Realness, brought to you by Nancy Ford.
Hashtag thank you.
As a curator, I'm often struck in conversations with other programmers, other filmmakers, and audience members about the perception of additional burdens being placed upon filmmakers of color, queer makers, gender nonconforming, and women makers around issues of representation. And obviously, without a doubt, audiences want to see, you know, authentic, I'm putting finger quotes with that, depictions of themselves on screen. However, there can be, you know, sometimes a further palpable sense of scrutiny when this expectation is being fueled by what feels like a scarcity of images to begin with. I'm curious about each of your thoughts when it comes to both of your own work and also the work of others, and being on the circuit and having been a funder for so long and producer for so long, Yancy, around expectations around representation, respectability politics, and artistic vision. Like, do they impact or inform one another? And how have you each navigated these expectations?
Should I go first?
Whoever would like to jump in.
I think that, you know, for me, in making Strong Island, you know, I had a really great, really cool job for 10 years, and when I left that job to focus on Strong Island exclusively, I had to put down that mindset of scrutinizing work for a specific, you know, strand on a specific network that was looking for specific material, and get back to the artist that I was, which was, you know, it was a wonderful detour, but it was a 10-year detour. And for me, in terms of respectability politics and expectation and representation, I have to be honest, maybe it's just me and, you know, my sort of Gen X, you know, when you get home from school, lock the door behind you and watch TV and do your homework and eat dinner because it's on the stove. I didn't think for 1 minute about anything other than who my characters were in real life and how to represent them authentically on screen. My mother, being an older Black woman who had lost her son, occupies in the film the center of her kitchen, in the center of the screen, and she is direct to camera because we never see African American women who have lost children in their homes, in their full agency, right? And that sort of establishing shot is repeated, character by character by character, in the film. And as for, you know, as far as my character in the film, which, you know, I had sort of this lingering hope that I wouldn't actually be in the film, but I shot myself. I didn't shoot myself. That was a really weird slip. My DP and I, you know, I knew that my facial expressions are often misunderstood and misinterpreted for all sorts of things, right? So, you know, in contrast to a lot of the characters in my film, which, you know, sort of have a bit of a step back, my character is shot in an extreme close-up, and it's done, we came up with that because if you are not as close as you possibly can be to my face, then I think that we miss two things. We actually miss the emotion on my face, which is very subtle, which I think comes from having to pass and having to hide and having to navigate your way through a straight world and a cisgendered world for most of your life. And I also think that, you know, I wanted to have a direct conversation with the audience. And so bringing the shot as close as I possibly could and speaking directly into, you know, and directly to camera was the best way to both be my authentic self, make the audience actually look and see me, and have a conversation with the audience that, you know, was, I think, really appropriate for the story that we were telling.
Thank you.
So I will address the issue of representation. I grew up in Pakistan in the 1980s, and we only had one television station. And on that station, we had the cheapest shows that the country, I guess, the television station could buy, and they were Russian, Chinese, British, American, Australian, what have you. And so we had this very wide range of ethnicities and representations, and it was funny because especially the middle classes humanized all these different peoples, but there was very little representation of us really on screen except for our local networks. And then the VHS came in, and Indian films started coming into the country, which was also really fantastic because that helped kind of humanize this perpetual enemy that's India next to Pakistan. So I grew up really like having the same heroes as people in the West. So that means that we had quite a lot of representation of the other. So couldn't dehumanize them the same way as when I moved to Canada when I was 15 and realized, oh my goodness, I'm brown. And then see that, oh my goodness, like I'm a Pakistani and it's not cool at all, like it's a bad thing, you know? So I think that it took me so long to realize that, okay, you know what, it's not happening. There are no brown friends in Friends. There's no brown people in the Sex and the City, though it's such a white city, except for the reject Pakistani busboy.
Right, played
she
for a
says,
joke.
you know, Samantha is desperate, and she says, oh God, you know, it's come to this, that the Pakistani busboys, you know, hitting on me or some nonsense like that. And then there's no, you know, and I realized that there's really serious, not only lack of representation, but dehumanization of South Asian bodies and brown people, intentional. And after 9/11, it got intensified, and I became pissed, you know. And then I dropped out of architecture school when the war on terror started happening. I was like, that's enough. I need to take matters in my own hands. I've been struggling since then to make movies, and Abu is like a totally, mostly self-funded, self-driven project. It's a product of not only my struggle with my father's passing and a cathartic film, but it's also very processing of my anger at how unrepresented brown people, people of color, and minorities are in the mainstream media.
Thank you. Thank
I
for
want you to
sharing.
know I know Arshad, and I love your anger. But, you know, it's true, right? I mean, sort of what's fascinating about actually Arshad and I is that, you know, we're both these Pakistani Muslim people. We're different in the respect that I was born in Canada, and, you know, you sort of immigrated, but like, we have these families that are very similar, and they come from very similar backgrounds. But, you know, I grew up in Canada. I was born in London, Ontario. I was raised in Sydney, Nova Scotia, which I've just been to all these Canadian film festivals. And people in Canada, even in Toronto, which is sort of the New York of Canada, say, how did you survive as a brown girl in Sydney? And I'm like, I don't know. I have no idea. Because it's deeply remote, and it's very isolating, and it's in this space on the ocean where nothing that you are or where you came from is recognizable to the people who are there. And you know, before social media and these digital spaces allowed us to connect across the world, that's, you know, where I grew up there, you know, and so it was before I could just say, oh great, it's fine, I'm just gonna tweet with this kid who's over in this other place. But representation does matter. You know, I mean, I was a lawyer for a minute, for a while, and I became an actor. And the reason I started writing was because I didn't think that in the casting process, I saw that people wanted me to be Muslim or queer or brown, and I just wasn't any of those things enough, even though that's everything that I am as a human being. And so I thought, okay, well, they don't want to cast me. Why don't I just write me, or something that is me or closer to me than they will write for people who are not me, if that makes sense. And you know, that was actually deeply liberating for me as an artist, as a human, as a brown person, as a Pakistani Muslim, lesbian, cisgendered, able-bodied woman, you know? And that's sort of been my artistic space. And you know, authenticity is everything, right? Like, that's become my mission as an artist. How do we create work, whether it's a short film, whether it's a sketch, whether it's a documentary, whether it's a narrative feature, whether it's whatever it is, it's something that is authentic, telling a real story. And so that is important across all of the different things, right? Across race and gender and socioeconomic class and orientation, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Geographic location. However, the thing that I've also realized is that, you know, that while this is the thing that we have to sort of struggle past, like, we just have to also not be true just to ourselves, but if you're being that authentic, what about the authenticity of the people you're also casting in your space? So the thing that was very important for me in my feature was that I'm nothing, I'm nobody, I do not have a voice, I'm not an artistic person with a space if I'm not being as authentic for the other people of other groups as I am with myself. So, you know, it's obvious, it's like we describe signature movies like a rom-com meets a Muslim melodrama coming of age story. But the Muslim South Asian character falls in love with a Mexican woman. And you see like a Muslim South Asian woman and a Mexican woman that fall in love, but you see their mothers. So we did not see anyone for the roles of the Mexican characters who are not Mexican people, right? And to me, that seems like the most obvious thing in the world. Like, why would we see anybody else? Why? Like, because it's easier, right? It's easier, it's cheaper, the pool becomes bigger. But fuck the pool, I'm sorry. But fuck the pool, right? Because the pool is only like this thing that we create in our minds, but like, honestly, we have the talent within the pool that is authentic and real. And so that's a conversation that like we intentionally have to do. And it's not just us sitting on this panel, that's something that anybody in this room, is there any other filmmaker in the room? Beautiful. Right? I can't see you, but I don't know if we're from the same place or we're from the same place, but we all have this power, right? It's a tiny power. It's like this big, right? But this tiny power allows us to say, okay, well, this role is written for this person with this personality. Who cares what their race or their orientation? Are they trans? Are they white? Are they green? Are they brown? And so that is something that the process of making this feature is really deeply solidified for me as a creator, as an artist, as a filmmaker, and I just feel like it's the way we can change all film. It's the way we can change everything we make. We all have that power. We just have to recognize it.
Thank you, Vaz. I want to talk for a second about the difference between being an independent filmmaking artist, documentarian, versus, I think, you know, how can I say this? Working for the mainstream industry with a capital I, if you will. I've often heard people that are industry decision makers, you know, talking about projects and different scripts and different things. And I found what I've liked to kind of call for shorthand the Highlander complex. Does everybody remember that 80s movie, The Highlander, There Can Be Only One? It's kind of rooted in, I think, Scottish white supremacy and sci-fi-ness. But it's really this kind of what I'm trying to get at. It's this idea that underrepresented communities have to be, or should only be, represented by one film, ever, of all time. So we see this a lot, I think, when folks talk about new work that focuses on the ball communities. Obviously, Paris is Burning is a classic and gets referenced, but anything that comes after, it's just like, no, that's derivative. That's not even worth talking about. And I'm not saying this. I'm saying this as more of the complex, if you will. I'm curious if we can talk about, strategies that break down that myth, strategies that literally lift up and amplify voices and representations that, maybe as an artist talking about your intentions in terms of who you're making it for. I know 2 of the films up here are deeply personal, and it's possible that you've made them for yourself as catharsis, as you said, and as well as social justice strategies. But I'm kind of curious, like, whose expectations concern you, and what does success look like individually for each of you as an artist? And does that change project to project?
This is Strong Island is the film that I had to make before I could make the films that I want to make, right? And so when I go on to make the films that I want to make, the way that I think about representation and casting and funding and creative teams, I think that intentional casting is important, right? I think representational casting is important. I think that there is really no difference between the philanthropic funding world of documentary and the private studio-driven, or even large studio or small studio-driven world of narrative independent film. There's beg, borrow, and steal on both sides of that coin. They are essentially one and the same. So I think that for me, it all comes down to identifying your authentic voice as a director. I think that if you don't have a specific vision for your film, that no matter how much you think about intentionality, no matter how much you think about representation, no matter how much you think about diversity across, the GLBTI community or, racial communities or, socioeconomic communities, no matter how much you think about any of those things, if you are not firmly rooted in what you want to do as an artist, none of those other things will actually be successful. They will all fail because they are essentially built on your understanding of what your goal is, right? So when I go out and look for, when I finally got to see Moonlight, right, it was very clear to me that Barry Jenkins knew, shot for shot, frame for frame, character for character, actor for actor, what he wanted, why he wanted it. And he executed each of those decisions, right? And so when I think about how to push back against the lack of representation, or rather, I went to an all-girls Catholic school. I'm used to elbowing my way into spaces where I want to be, right? I think that Barry, if I may call you by your first name, he knew what he wanted. You don't get Mahershala Ali by accident, right? You have this thing in your mind. It's called vision as a director. And if you can find people who are willing to stand behind that vision as a director, it may take longer, and it does take longer, right? If we put all of these films on a representational graph, right, and it was sort of filmed by here and timed by here, you would see that lots of films that are lesser quality or complexity got funded and produced in a much shorter amount of time than Moonlight. It's not necessarily going to be easier, but I do think it's going to be a film that at the end of the day does the work that you want it to do. In the same way that Raoul Peck spent 10 years fundraising and shooting and getting permission for using Baldwin's work for I Am Not Your Negro and The 13th and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Documentary film is a different animal, but not entirely, right? It's a different animal in that you do not write the beginning, middle, and end. You do not know what is going to happen as you are shooting, and therefore, in my case, sometimes it extends your production timeline, right? But in terms of how you approach the rest of it as a director, that same intentionality is reflected in documentary film as it is in narrative film. From every single decision, for me, it was about the production assistant who drove the van, to the DI assistant editor who ingested all of our material, to as many of below the line staff as I could, being diverse. Why? Because then each of them will have Strong Island in their credits and can use that to get a foot up into the next job. Perhaps it's my naivete and perhaps it's my astrological sign, but I just...
Which is?
Aries.
Okay, there we are. Oh, you had to know that.
But I just think that I'm beyond the point in my career, my career being, having started in 2000, maybe 1996 actually. I'm beyond feeling like I need to ask permission. I don't need to ask permission to shoot the film in the way that I want to shoot it. I don't need to ask permission to cast people in the way that I want to cast them. I just don't feel the need going into my next project to ask anybody permission to do anything. And I think that is what produces award-winning work, when you stop looking for permission, right? Which doesn't necessarily mean it's going to be any easier to get funding or anything else like that, but in terms of the creative approach, I'm done. Actually, I haven't even started. I'm not asking anybody permission for anything.
I support all of that. Thank you, Lexi. And there's something beautiful in that you mentioned earlier, talking about agency with your mother and showing her in her full power in the kitchen and the domestic sphere. And so, talking about intentionality, I just wanted to quickly say, one of the things I completely adore about your film is that every shot is intentional, every cut is intentional. It's precision. So thank you for that and illuminating further on that vision.
And of course, you know that it was my DP and my editor and my producer Dustin Bonds and co-producer. We all, there were millions of decisions in each frame of Strong Island, and they started with the first time I rolled action.
Thank you. Arshad.
Thank you. So I'll let Fozia discuss casting, but my film was very, very different from yours because I was using over 50 years of archival material, photos that my father had taken as far back as the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, and then VHS footage and mini DV, high 8, all these iPhone, flip cam. So I was using a massive amount of archival and found material, and the challenge was, how do I make it fit together? So I had a brilliant editor at Tianganyo, I just cannot thank enough, and some help from my co-writers Matt Jones and my story editor Shelly Tepperman, because I had this, it was a very complex story to tell, and what do you take and what do you prioritize, so when you see the film, you understand that this is a lot packed into
It's truly a visual kaleidoscope of source. Just everything that you can imagine is in there and done so well. So kudos to your team.
So my film was very different, and I had to try it, and there were things that I didn't have, like intimate meetings and discussions with my dad and so on. So, because I made my film after my father already passed away, so it was very difficult. So I used animation and I used different, Bollywood clips and stuff like that to represent the same emotion. So I used these other tricks, because I didn't have that luxury of intentionally deciding these are the shots I need, this is what I want, and then go and shoot it. So I had a very different process that way. So I just wanted to address that, and I'll let you move on with the casting.
Oh boy. What's so funny about intentionality is that when I think of myself as a human in the world, I'm like, everything is deeply intentional. Like, this is a deeply intentional space. When I thought about, why do I have this film that's called Signature Move? I mean, it's inspired by my love, my falling in love with a Mexican woman, in Chicago and us finding these connections across seemingly very different communities, and realizing that actually our communities are so similar, whether it's our families, our mothers, our obsession with cilantro. You know, like, we are the same, you know, and part of that can only happen in the city of Chicago because Chicago has some of the largest populations in the West of Muslims, South Asians, and Mexican people. So you know, that's kind of the background for it. You know, as we sort of became, I had written a short film because that's what I knew I could do, right? Like, so my background is very circuitous. I mean, I glazed over it a little bit, but like, my background is someone who wanted to be an actor when she was a kid, and then she gets to graduating high school and her family's like, okay, Fazia, what are you going to do now? Seriously. And I'm like, shit, what do I do? And still very privileged in the respect that my family wants me to get a higher education background. So it's like, are you going to be a doctor, a lawyer, or an engineer? And I'm like, shit, I hate math, lawyer. And so, you know, it was either that or get married, and I didn't want to get married, because what the fuck was that about? So I went to law school, and it was actually not until law school that I came to this space of realizing I had to go back to acting and creating. And so this creation space is really kind of a found space in many ways. And you know, I like to think that the universe said, okay, we're gonna help you find an intentional space, but I feel like I'm so grateful to have found it. And I also, it's a great privilege to say, oh, I have a law degree, I was a lawyer, now I'm gonna leave that and go be a starving actress in the United States, right? It's something that you can't do in a lot of countries. So, so for me, like, the path to even creating is very kind of, very circuitous. And you do get tired of people saying, well, Fazia, you look Mexican, but you don't look South Asian. And I'm like, wait a minute, but that's what I am, you know? And so those kernels in the casting room are deeply informed my truth about what I think about who should be playing whom. That was the beginning, right? Because it's not like I knew any of this as an actor, taking acting classes or taking in some amazing acting or theater or film school. It was people telling me that I am not me enough. And that's really confusing. And I think that that's kind of the struggle that we face in this world right now. And so that has deeply informed my need to, whatever I'm doing, as a writer, you know, I look at someone and I think, oh my God, I love this person. They're so funny and beautiful and weird, and I love weird and confusing and complicated and wonderful. And I'll write them, but it's for them to play. You know, it's so if I met you and that's what I thought about you, you will play you, not him to play you, you know? It's like that's to me the beauty and the joy of creating. So like, when I think about what can we make, what can we do, what is the power that we have as creators, like my dream is like Shonda Rhimes meets Issa Rae, you know, with a little brown sparkle pony thrown in there for good measure. But part of that is because I can be in the things, but I can push people and the stories to be authentically who they are as well. And so that, I guess, is my thought on casting, and I've already talked about it with the film, but I you know, somebody asked me recently, well, why do like queer film festivals matter, or why does it matter that you're doing this? And I think because we have an opportunity to have a platform, right? And I think we have a platform to talk about how important this is, and also I think it matters. And you know, I would be lying if I said I didn't want Hollywood to buy my next pilot or my next movie, but I don't want them to buy it if they're gonna tell me that the people that I'm casting are wrong for the roles. So it is complicated, and I think this kind of conversation and all of us being here and these kind of spaces, you know, collectively we can sort of change the narrative of what we want and what we want to see and who we want to see in those spaces, regardless of whether it's, in an indie film, a documentary or a narrative, but also whether it's on HBO or Netflix. Like, we do have that power, but we have to sort of choose to speak out about it.
Thank you. I would like to now open it up to the audience for questions. I'm going to hand my mic to Tim, and if you have a question, raise your hand. He'll run it over to you, and we can continue the dialogue.
So my name's Carrie Adams. I'm coming from Austin, Texas. I'm a closeted filmmaker, performance artist, whatever. But I work as a museum curator there. So first, I just want to thank all of you for being here, because I feel like because of your work, there's literally a generation of QTPOC filmmakers who might be born free, who might be able to do the kind of work that they want to do at the beginning. And so I thank you for that. As I know I'm doing that comment. I'm gonna have a question.
You take your time, you do what
okay.
you need.
Lovely.
So, you know, as someone who's trying to take their film work more seriously, this need to navel gaze, as I think all of you touched on it in some way, I think is really important in terms of getting to the work. And so my question is, do you believe that there's this sort of like closing gap between cultural capital and authenticity, and sort of personal experience, and sort of monetary capital that powers filmmaking, particularly you know, distribution companies like HBO, Showtime, and how will that ultimately impact queer filmmakers of color?
Oh God. You know, I'm just gonna jump in quickly on that, just that what's so lovely, because you especially mentioned HBO, is that, you know, I live in Chicago, and one of the other wonderful human beings that's been at the festival here at Frameline this week is Amar Christensen, and you know, he created a space, a digital space called Open TV, and they created the space for a really wonderful web series to have a home called Brown Girls. And Brown Girls is the web series that HBO just recently picked up to develop. And it's the story of a queer brown Muslim girl, a young millennial, and the story of a young black woman, inspired by two wonderful poets, one of them being Jamila Woods and one of them being Fatima Askar. So, in Chicago. And what's lovely about that is that I really feel, and by the way, I was supposed to be in it and I couldn't because of signature moves, so don't worry about it. We're gonna find a place. But, I've been talking to Sam Bailey about it, but what's beautiful about that is that truly being a Chicagoan, being a brown human, being a brown woman, being a brown queer woman, being a non-mainstream human, it gives us hope that it's possible. Because that web series went viral. And HBO is like, yes, we want this, because this is a story we haven't told yet about these beautiful intersectional people and their stories and everything that goes along with it. So I think it's possible in that massive black hole, because that's the reality, is I think it's still, a lot of these places are still kind of, you know, they're like, we have mandates, we have to make this, we have to make this, we have to make it now, we have to make it, and then you meet them and they're like, we love you, but not yet. You know what I mean? And so I think that, like, there's still this control of this other power, and it's Hollywood, and it's not quite as beautiful and queer and brown and LGBTQIA as we all are. But there are moments, and I think that web series is a beautiful moment of what is possible. And I'm so proud of them, but it's hard. No matter what they say, no matter what they say they want, they still have people who don't look like you and I, or any of us, or dress like us, that have the power. And so that is why, again, it's so important to have this conversation and for us to not just make the stuff, but to get into funding this stuff or get into the places of the power to say yes to people like anybody in this room. So yeah, that's what I want to tell you. Hi, I love you, by the way.
You know, I'd like you to consider something for a moment. You have already been born free. Your freedom comes from the decisions that you make. Your freedom comes from your willingness to make sacrifices. Your freedom comes from you. Your freedom is not something that is bestowed upon you by any other entity or any other person. Your freedom is your voice. Your artistic voice, which you have to exercise in the world as a manifestation of the fact that you are and have been born free. I think that it would be useful for you to spend some time binge watching TV, right? Go find, in fact, I think on the route this morning, there was an article that said, if you want to see an example of intersectional feminism, watch Black-owned TV. And one of the shows that they referenced was Queen Sugar, and I forgot the other one, right? I think that there is more content out there than you might be aware of. And I think that one of the things that is important in terms of you doing the work that you want to do in your lifetime, not waiting for the next generation to feel as if they were born free, right? I think it's important for you to do your work in your lifetime and to seek out the examples of the people who are doing that work, right? At great sacrifice, at, beg, borrow, and steal, at, sort of finding out people's phone numbers, calling friends of friends, however you have to get to the decision makers. People who are, I was on a panel at the Full Frame Documentary Film Festival in April. And I made the very important point that I think that you need to, and probably already do know. There is an entire stream of content makers who do not care what the mainstream is paying attention to. They are putting their work on the internet, they are creating their own YouTube channels, they are creating their own Vimeo channels, and that is where influencers are looking for content, right? Exactly, the web series, that's where people look for content. So do not for a minute believe that your freedom is conditional on someone else's decision, right? When I got my first grant for Strong Island, it was $15,000. I bought 2 cameras, big mistake, FY, FY is my abbreviation of FYI. Don't ever buy cameras, just rent, right? I put the cameras on a credit card and I used the grant to pay staff, right? I got folks to sacrifice. They believed in the project. They worked at below their rates until I could afford, after years and years and years and years and years and years of fundraising, to pay them, what they were worth. But I found a way. I found a way, and there's story after story of, filmmakers who shoot nights, weekends, sick days, holidays. You have a way, if you take a step back and look at what you can give up to make your vision and to make manifest in your lifetime the work that you want to do, right? I can't tell you, I had a great job. I worked 11, 12 hours a day. I would come home, I would maybe be lucky to spend 2 or 3 hours of quality time with my partner, and then I would work from after dinner, she would go to bed, and I would work until 2 o'clock in the morning, sleep for 4 or 5 hours, and get up and do it again, right? I did that for over 10 years. And it may seem like there isn't an end to that process. There may not seem like there's a light at the end of that tunnel, but there is. And I want you to do that work now. I don't want you to look up here and think about the next generation. I want you to look up here and think about you. That's where I think the important part of this panel and understanding how you create models of representation come from. You are already here. You can be the example for the next generation, not us, right? You have to accept that and get out there and do your, and you know, I have a camera now that I lend to my neighbor, right? And what did he do? He went out and secured a location for me for the film. You know, like we have a little sort of impromptu collective. Nobody charges anybody to do anything, because we all know that without one another, we wouldn't be able to get to where we were. You and whoever you work with, whoever you trust, whoever is willing and able to make the same kind of sacrifices that you know are necessary to make your work, you should be working with those people now, to do your work now, because you've got one life, you've got one shot.
So, thank you for that. I think that it's very important indeed that you make work for yourself, and that these democratic ways like YouTube and so on are giving people voice. Those who are savvy and able to use them to their advantage can do it. However, I think that we are all storytellers. We are all telling our stories in our ways, and we are creating content. And the odds are stacked against us, because once we've made that content, and it's great content, then it's very difficult to get it into the mainstream, because the mainstream had its own agendas, and we all know that. We cannot not know that. And how we can help each other is spread the word, use our social reach, get other people's social reach to amplify each other's voices, okay? That's what we can do. And we can help each other. And I can already see these people, these filmmakers help other filmmakers, help younger filmmakers, and help each other, okay? But we cannot be, we have to realize that a lot of the content is supported by big corporations, big money, and they're the ones who are not only who are vertically integrated, they're creating content and they're pushing the same content, and they're not letting other voices get in. Thus the need for a panel like this, thus the need for queer film festivals, thus the need for South Asian film festivals. So let's really be very realistic about where we spend our money and where we want to see the content. And it's really, really, really important to be mindful of that and really demand that other voices also come into the fray.
Hi, my name is Lindsay Rodriguez. My question is, I guess coming from a personal spot, it's just how do you deal with such intimate and hurtful and painful subjects that are part of your life, but how do you, I guess coming from writing perspectives and just doing the work, how can you not just get past that, but I guess day by day, get through that? Does that make sense?
Well, I think you just said it. It's day by day. You know, there's no getting past it. There's no such thing as closure. In my opinion, I think closure is something that people who've never had tragic things happen in their lives cling to you know, to convince themselves that if something tragic ever did happen in their lives, that they would be able to survive it, right? And I also think that in my case, for my film, my brother had been killed and dead in the ground for 15 years before I started shooting a frame of the film. And so the work that you have to do, in my case, and I think in the case of many filmmakers who are doing work about the epidemic of violence against African Americans in the United States that is relentless and unending, and that we see time after time once verdicts are rendered, and then, you know, the day after or the next day we get the truth of the matter, and the truth of the matter is exactly the opposite of what was presented in court and, you know, resulted in acquittals or not guilty verdicts, right? I'm not sure if you've seen the Philando Castile shooting. That shooting happened so quickly. It was impossible for that police officer to have had an entire string of thoughts about, this man is smoking pot, and if he doesn't care about his 4-year-old child, then he must not care about me. That's bullshit, right? Nobody has like an entire tome of self-reflection in the amount of time that it took for him to kill that man, right? So my advice to you is to accept and understand that it's going to be a painful process if you choose something that's happened in your life, but that other people have also experienced as subject matter for a film. People are going to, I've had, you know, in Canada, in all sorts of different places, I have had more people than you could possibly imagine come up to me after screenings and say, I had this happen in my family, I had that happen in my family. Last week, my neighbor's son was shot and killed by police. It is horrifying, the number of murders that are happening that have completely gone unreported and unpunished, that I'm learning about simply by doing Q&As and post-Q&As with Strong Island. Whatever you have in your life, whoever you have in your life, right, that you use to steel yourself against the hardest thing that you will ever do, begin to cultivate the connection to that thing now. Because it will be one process making the work, it will be an entirely different process releasing the work on the festival circuit, and then, you know, God willing, it will be another process releasing the film to a wider audience. And each time those things happen, you are going to have to figure out how to adapt, how to absorb, how to navigate other people's responses to your work. Because they will, for the most part, not be about you. They will be about them.
And I would add to that, that the most important thing for you is to have collaborators, because none of us made our films on our own. And it's important to have collaborators that are challenging you, collaborators that are not agreeing with you, collaborators that are saying you're full of shit, or don't do this, or this is self-sorrow, or this or that or that. And you have to listen to them, you have to be open to that, and you have to fight, but then realize your, you know, but also you have to have your own voice, and also understand that, okay, this is what I want, and stick to your guns when you need to. But really, it is about having the right collaborators, because those are the people you must learn to trust, and they must learn to trust you, and you must build that relationship moving forward, because it's a really long ride, this making a film. It's a hard, difficult thing, you know, and you not only have your subjects to worry about, but you have your collaborators to worry about, you have your ego to worry about, you have the perception of how the film is going to be perceived, and also in the end you must realize this is a piece of entertainment than education, and first of all, foremost, entertainment, and they have to be able to connect to it, and those are very difficult things, so you just keep doing it, keep improving.
Yeah, you know, there's nothing that either of you have said that is not true and real and raw. The sort of way that I've personally survived, because comedy is so important to me, my most painful moments have, I've laughed through. That was my survival tool. And I don't think that's for everybody, but that's sort of my power. My power comes from laughter and from finding ways, even in the darkest moments, to find that. And so, you know, for me, when I think of the thing, I'm deeply inspired by my mother. You know, your film is named Abu. You know, I'm deeply inspired by Amma, you know, or Ammi. And, you know, my mother, the way I depict her in anything I've written, whether it's my one-woman play that I'm turning into a screenplay, or a signature move where you see her as a deeply empathetic woman who's going through a lot of loneliness, and she's quirky and lovely and wonderful and doesn't need you to save her as a Muslim woman and as a headscarf. Like, that was important to me given the kind of world we live in and the way culture, American Western culture, looks at Muslim women right now. That being said, you know, I am deeply aware of, you know, what's below the surface of the iceberg. You know what I mean? Like there's a lot of stuff that's not in the work I create that is true to where I come from or who I am or my story or my history. But where I'm at right now as an artist, I've gotten to the point of being this person by letting go of, and I don't think it's safe for everyone. I don't think everyone should do it. I don't think everybody can do it. You know what I mean? It's literally individual for every single human being. But for me, the only way I could get to be a person who's making content, sitting here on a panel that's so wonderful and making stuff that feels celebratory or even comedic, is that I had to find a place of self-love. And the self-love for me, very personally, was a place where I had to find spaces of letting go of the trauma or the pain that was connected to our parents, because they're really traumatic. They can be, you know what I mean? I mean, the places we come from, our roots, our stories, our family, our origins, our history, I mean, that is so deeply traumatic. And I think especially as someone who's a person of color, a queer person of color, an intersectional human, an immigrant, like the child of immigrants, I mean, we are dealing with layers and layers and layers of possible trauma. And yeah, so for me, I got to this place by saying, I know my mother was so complex, but the way I need to move past it is to sort of see the fact that there are things in her that are in me. You know, and there's the good things and the bad things. The good things, I'm like, I'm gonna work through them. I will not be controlled by my past if I can. And the good things, I'm gonna celebrate them. And so a lot of my work, while it's deeply comedic, it comes from a place of reconciling the pain. You know what I mean? I mean, like it comes from a place of reconciling the past, the pain, the trauma, but coming out in a place where I'm like, look, if I'm gonna move forward and be a good person and love who I am and have a good time and love someone else really fucking well, I gotta get past this shit or I'm gonna die. Like that's kind of where I come from. So yeah, that's where my mother's in everything that I'm inspired by come from. And it's complicated, and I think that's the beauty of getting to make something, is that you can deal with your own complications the way you need to do, right? There's the thing we see on screen, and there's the shit below the surface that is part of that iceberg that we don't need to watch, but you fucking went through, and that's all part of the process of creation.
I think we have time for maybe one or two more questions. One over there.
Yes, you.
Bringing you the mic.
Yes, you.
Hi. I'd love to hear you talk a little more about finding actors and casting, just because, you know, we're talking about representation here, and as queer trans people of color, obviously we're writing from personal places where we have very specific characters in our lives that we want to see well represented and well played and well performed on screen. So I'm wondering, especially for those of us who are still scraping for resources and access to, you know, might not have access to casting agencies or anything like that, where do you look, and to what extent do you think we should be prioritizing identity over training, and do you believe in using untrained actors? Yeah, thank you.
I would personally cast Scarlett Johansson in every role in my next movie, basically, because she's such a diverse actress. I do a lot of shorts, and I work as a production designer and art director on other people's movies, and a lot of the directors that I've worked with have worked with marvelous actors. As we all know, there are so many actors of every ethnicity, and as Fozia was saying, there's no reason never to cast someone in a Mexican role who's not Mexican, because we have enough talent from that country in here in the US or Canada or so on. So it's very important that at least, at the very, very least, if the character is written that way, you respect that And I really urge my fellow filmmakers and casting agents and so on to make sure that kind of, at the very minimum, is respected. You know, otherwise, I do think that that's one thing that I would say that I would definitely like to keep in my work at least.
For me, you know, casting doesn't necessarily work in the same way, but you know, we narrowed down. I had this dream when I started Strong Island that I was going to be able to make a film about race in America without any white people in it. And we were almost able to do that, except there were two people who I just had to accept had kernels of the story that were more important than my, you know, than my goal, right? Than my hope. And so they're in the film. They worked to great effect. I'm glad that I let go of that decision. But you know, from a documentary standpoint, I think that it's just making sure that you ask everyone who might know or who you might think doesn't know about something, what they think about something, right? Whether or not they seem like the expert, whether or not they seem like the resident, you know, professor on X, Y, or Z, or A, B, or C. I think it's going outside of the typical circles and the typical talking head, you know, folks in nice clothes that are ironed and dry cleaned, and seeing what ordinary people have to say. Because I've said often in Q&As like this that official stories line up so neatly because they are authored, right? And that the truth is messy because it is made up of different perspectives of a whole, right? That doesn't necessarily make complicated truth false. It actually makes it more true, if that makes sense. The simple truths I never trust. Complicated truths I trust because I have experienced life and I have experienced truth as complicated things.
You know, in terms of, you know, casting, like the way I've sort of classically written and, you know, is I write for people. I see someone that I think is amazing. I'm like, oh my God, you need to be this weird creature in this thing I'm making because I couldn't come up with anything better than who you are. And so that's often been, you know, whether it was in my web series Camp Kardashian, like, or the short films, it was inspired by this human being who already exists. It should play this role because they are that, like it's the same thing. So, you know, when it came time, so casting Signature Move was a first for me. I've made short films. I have always thought I'm gonna make a thing that I can afford. I'm gonna make a thing that I can make with the resources I have, which means, okay, I have access to this hat, that chair, these people on this stage, and like those lights. That's it. I'm gonna make that project. And I will write it so it fits into that room, that project, these people, and that hat, right? And that's been my reality. When it came to Signature Move, suddenly, you know, I was connected to this wonderful producer in Chicago who said, I'll help you find some money. That being said, it was deeply independent. There was no big production company, but we found some investors who said, we will put money into what you're doing. And I was like, wait, like real money? Like money? Like American money? Like, what do you mean? Are you talking rupees? Like, I was very confused. But so there was some money. It was still a very ultra low budget SAG indie film, okay? So it gave us some space to have a casting agent. And a wonderful, one of the missions of one of the producers I was working with was everything had to be made in Chicago. New City Magazine, Chicago Magazine, the Chicago Film Project. Why do we go outside for the things that we have inside? Why do we go out to LA when in Chicago we have my cell phone that drops from my chair? Like, you know what I mean? Like, why do we go elsewhere when we have everything we need in-house? So let's cast the crew and the team, the production team, everything will be done in Chicago. So that was part of the mission. And what felt beautiful to me about that was the story felt very Chicago story. And even though it's about all these women and brown-skinned women, I was like, okay, to me, brown-skinned women are Chicago. Other people think Chicago's like, I don't know, politics and the white mayor and, I don't know, illegal alcohol running and Al Capone. And I'm like, no, it's the fucking brown people who live here. Like, we are everything in this city, and the immigrants in this city. So we worked with a casting agency who's amazing, and it was a first, and they said, okay, well, who do you want to see for the role of Alma, your co-star, who's a Mexican woman? And I said, well, and I know most of these women, these people, these actors in town, being in the city, being someone who's done theater in town, being someone who's done on-camera work in town, being someone who's just in that world. And they're like, yeah, but listen, we could probably get bigger names if we opened it up to somebody Puerto Rican. And I'm like, I love Puerto Rican people, but this is a Mexican character. Okay, yeah, but what about the, so it wasn't, they're amazing. They continue to be amazing, and I love them, but it was still a conversation that had to be had of, I hear you, I know what everyone else has done before, but I don't want to do that. And I know it's going to be harder because we're going to see fewer people, and that person that always gets cast in everything is not going to get this fucking job. You know what I mean? Because there is, especially, Chicago is huge, but it's so small. And people, the same people get cast in the roles that come into town. And so the same people did not get cast into these roles. And what so I love, and she's gonna be here, and if you come to our movie screening on Friday night, Sari Sanchez, who plays my co-star, she's obviously beautiful, but she is so brilliant as an artist, as an actor. And she, as a half Russian Jew and half Mexican woman from Guanajuato, Mexico, gets told all the time that she is not Mexican enough to be Mexican. And when she told me that, I'm like, ah, like my head exploded. Like, that is the problem. So we have to work harder. I just really believe we have to fucking work harder to say, you are who you are. I want you because of exactly who you are. And so that was important, and you did have to fight people to do that. And maybe it was easier because it was a very indie space and we didn't have this big money involved. But one thing I hope that I can, not even hope, I mean, I guess I hope, but I crave, I want, because it's truly authentic to the only thing that I want to do as an artist, is that when someone, because I believe in manifestation, when the bigger production company says, we're gonna give you all of these millions of dollars to make this movie, and when they say, let's cast this person who is not trans in this trans role, I'm gonna be like, fuck you, no, I don't want your money, I'm gonna go here instead and make it on my own instead, because I want someone who is authentic to that role. But those are really hard conversations to have with yourself. But they're important, and there are so many beautiful artists who are doing it, and so many who have been at Frameline the last week who believe in that, whether it's Amar from Open TV or Jen Richards, who made her story, and the what is her doc, the T?
More Than Tea.
More Than Tea. I mean, these are people who are not just talking about it, but who are living that truth, and who are people who are deeply inspiring to me to continue to cast that way, to write that way. And more than that, I'm sorry, I know I'm talking a lot, but like, we have this opportunity when there's a role for, like, a character who's like, oh, they're behind the bar and they're nondescript. Why not use our tiny bit of power in the world and cast that nondescript role as somebody who might not be seen by, like, Hollywood? Whether it's somebody trans, whether it's somebody who's differently abled, whether it's somebody who, a QPOC, whether, like, it doesn't, like, you have so much power. And if anything, it populates your world and your film, and if anything, it shows subversively, changes the narrative to other people watching, because you don't need to talk about it, but when we see that, we are changed. We just are. I'm like, oh yeah, of course, why wouldn't they be a bartender, That's all. Bye.
Thank you so much for all of your thoughtful responses. I'm getting the sign that we're at time, so unfortunately we have to wrap up the part of this dialogue here. I wanted to